Good morning. This meeting of the board is a hybrid physical virtual meeting. I'd like to welcome those in the boardroom with me today. While keeping your microphones muted, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice. At this time, I will ask the secretary to the board to address a few technical and protocol items.
We have a quorum. The full board is present for this meeting. Chairman Logan, Board Member Hall, and Board Member Smith. Your microphone should normally be muted except for board members and presenters. Please ensure that you have silenced any mobile devices you have with you. The virtual portion of this hybrid meeting is on Cisco WebEx. We have 3 OIT staff, Jerry Versace, Ricardo Matos, and Ben Rana monitoring and managing the meeting. They will be locking this meeting and no new connections will be allowed. OIT will be advancing the slides, so you will hear presenters say, next slide. If you are an FCA or FCA staff member, you're considered a panelist. The outside visitors are considered attendees. Everyone will see the slides as they advance. If you lose connectivity in this meeting, please contact Jerry Versace. Lastly, this meeting is being recorded. The video recording of the open portion of this meeting will be posted for public viewing for a limited period of time. Chairman Logan, that concludes the technical and protocol items. We're ready to continue when you are.
Thank you. The secretary will read an opening statement on the Government in the Sunshine Act.
This is an open Farm Credit Administration board meeting under the Government and the Sunshine Act. If anyone raises a subject that may be discussed in closed session as permitted by the Government and the Sunshine Act, Chairman Logan will entertain a motion to close the meeting.
We will now review the published meeting agenda. Is there a motion to adopt the agenda as published?
I move to adopt the agenda as published.
I second that motion.
The motion has been made and seconded. Is there any further discussion on the matter? Hearing none, the secretary will record the vote on the motion.
Mr. Hall?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Chairman Logan?
Aye. The motion carries. Next, we will consider whether any portions of the meeting should be closed to the public.
Mr. Chairman, the agenda does not include items that we should properly discuss in closed session. I move that the entire meeting remain open.
Second the motion.
The motion has been made and seconded. Is there any further discussion on the matter? Hearing none, the secretary will record the vote on the motion.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Hall?
Aye.
Chairman Logan?
Aye. Motion carries. Please turn to tab 1. The next item on the agenda is the approval of minutes as presented behind tab 1.
I move to approve the minutes for the March 14th, 2024 regular board meeting as presented.
I second that motion.
The motion has been made and seconded. Is there any further discussion on the matter? Hearing none, the secretary will record the vote on the motion.
Mr. Hall?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Chairman Logan?
Aye. Motion carries. Please turn to tab 2. At this time, I will ask Rebecca Kaiser of ODAE and Brianna Tomlinson of OE to present the quarterly report on economic conditions and farm credit system condition and performance. This is an information item.
Good morning, Chairman Logan, Board Member Hall, and Board Member Smith. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. My name is Rebecca Kaiser. I'm an economist in the Office of Data Analytics and Economics. With me is Brianna Tomlinson of the Office of Examination. Together, we will be jointly presenting the quarterly report on economic conditions and system conditions. Next slide, please. Just to start with an outline, I will start by going through a couple of macroeconomic conditions, then taking a look into some of the agricultural markets and what we're seeing going on there, while still looking at a couple of the risks that we're seeing specifically in the livestock industry. Next slide, please. So to start out, inflation has been a hot topic of concern the past 2 years. with inflation hitting highs in 2022 and 2023. Inflation came in yesterday morning high again at 3.5% year over year. PCE inflation is also high with 2.8% year over year in February. With these high inflation rates, the Federal Reserve has increased interest rates to try and cool this down and bring it closer to their goal level of 2%. However, the last interest rate hike was in July of 2023, and the federal funds rate has stayed the same since that time in July. The current federal funds rate target is 5.25 to 5.5%, and the Federal Reserve has kind of stopped doing rate hikes to prepare for bringing those rates down again as inflation cools. However, with these high inflation levels that we're still seeing, the timing of these rate cuts has been debated. Concerns about a recession in 2023 were high. We saw many forecasts showing that there would be a likely recession before the end of the year. These concerns remain going into 2024. However, there are still some favorable economic measures that show that the economy is strong, including low and stable unemployment rates, positive GDP growth expected in the first quarter of 2024, and rising consumer spending. However, no matter what interest rates do and whether the rate cuts happen this year or they're later this year, interest rates and expenses with regard to interest rates are a major financial concern for most consumers and producers. Next slide, please. Farms and ag producers are expected to be in a tight spot again in 2024 after a sharp decline in farm income in 2023. This is mostly because high production costs are coming back up since 2023. So in the chart on the left, we can see that most costs kind of peaked in 2022 and then decreased substantially in 2023. Now some costs expected, like pesticides and fertilizers, are expected to come back up in 2024. Interest rates, as shown as the blue line in this graph, really spiked in 2023 and are expected to come back down in 2024 with the rate cuts. However, with the pushing back of these rate cuts into later this year, it's likely that we won't see a decrease in these interest expenses, which is going to put a push upward on total production expenses for ag producers. Also, another reason for why net cash farm income is expected to decline this year is the decrease in government payments, those mostly coming from the Dairy Margin Coverage Program, down 78%, the Agricultural Risk Coverage Program, down 85%, as well as supplemental and ad hoc disaster assistance, down 17% in 2024. And finally, one of the big reasons for this drop in net cash farm income is the decrease in cash receipts as well. You can see this on the graph for animals and animal products, as well as crops, shown in the blue and the green lines on the chart. Next slide, please. So really what we're seeing with these decrease in cash receipts is declines in prices for our major crops, including corn, soybeans, and wheat. 2022 and 2023 had high prices, and now we're seeing as supplies, as measured in stocks, are increasing for these products, the prices are coming down more. Right now, prices are close to break-even levels, even teetering, below break-even levels for producers. Which is putting a tight squeeze on ag producers, especially going into planting. This year, farmers will also have less price protection with crop insurance, with projected prices for corn at $4.66, which is down from $5.91 last year, and soybeans at $11.55 for a projected price, down from $13.76. Just to show how important some of this crop insurance can be to farmers and producers, last year in Kansas, 56% of farm income came from net crop insurance payments. And that was from a combination of drought in Kansas with lower yields as well as low prices. Next slide, please. Speaking of weather conditions, so far weather is looking good. Drought conditions are improving into 2024. If we look on the graph on the left, we see that corn and soybeans levels are down under 5% in extreme and exceptional drought. Those are the two highest categories of drought as monitored by the U.S. Drought Monitor. Wheat is at 0%, which is a stark contrast to this time last year when that same number sat at over 30%. With these good conditions spread across the U.S., we're still seeing a few areas of localized drought, mainly in Iowa and in the Southwest region, as you can see the red spots on those graphs. Right now, any dry conditions aren't too much of a worry. They're still good for planting and will be good for farmers to be able to get that seed in the ground. The outlook for moisture is also looking good, showing that these areas will improve going into June. Next slide, please. Moving on to the livestock side of the industry. Cattle inventory is at the lowest point in 50 years with just over 87 million head. This passed by the 2014 lows at the low of the last cattle cycle. With these low inventory numbers, we're also seeing record high prices. USDA forecasted that 750 to 800 pound feeder steers would average $248.50 a hundredweight. Many areas of the country are already seeing higher prices than this. With these high prices, margins are taking off. Cow-calf margins right now are expected to be about $500 per head for 2024, which compared to a 5-year average from 2018 to 2022 of about $112 is a 4-fold increase in profits. While cow-calf producers are seeing large profits and high prices, these profits will be distributed differently and vary by segment of the supply chain. So feeders right now are also expected to make positive profits in 2024. Their numbers are about $125 a head. And packers are expected to make slim but near zero profits, maybe about $24 in 2024. And this pattern of profits is indicative of the higher costs that packers are seeing with higher operating costs, higher labor costs, as well as higher costs for buying fed cattle. Right now, these high prices are likely to stick around for the next couple of years until herds are being able to be rebuilt. Right now, producers are taking advantage of the high prices they can get for feeder heifers instead of retaining those heifers as replacements for the breeding herd. Heifer retention is low. The last survey showed that beef cattle producers are retaining 1% fewer heifers than last year, which is not conducive to herd rebuilding. Interest rates, high interest rates for operating notes, as well as short-term loans, are also going to hamper expansion and push back cattle expansion for another couple of years. Next slide, please. Recently, there have been a couple of events that are shaping production risk in the livestock industry, and I'd like to talk about a couple of them. The first is the Texas wildfires. So the smokehouse fire that broke out in late February grew to be the largest fire in Texas history, burning over 1 million acres. It destroyed structures, range land, and killed cattle. Early estimates from March showed that about 7,000 to 10,000 head were killed, but this does not take into account total destruction from these fires, total value loss. While these losses will be felt in local areas, they're not expected to affect the national beef markets. So as you can see in the map, the Texas Panhandle has a high concentration of cattle, especially in feedlots and dairies. Effects from these fires will be felt locally at the loss of range and feed, as well as in the long timeline to build back herds with high prices, as well as high interest rates when they're trying to rebuild their structures or any fencing that they may need to redo. I also want to talk briefly about highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI. HPAI was detected in dairy cattle in multiple states, starting with Texas. This is the first U.S. case of transmission from wild birds into cattle. So far, the virus seems to have a low fatality rate in cattle and is causing a decrease in milk output, but the cattle seem to recover. Right now, there's no worry about the spread of the virus from milk products to humans, as no milk from sick cows ever enters the milk supply, and milk that is in the milk supply or on shelves, is pasteurized before hitting shelves. However, there has been one case of a producer contracting the virus from cattle. He was a dairy cattle worker. He seems to be recovering well. So not much worry about humans catching it from other mammals. Now we're also seeing the spread of this virus into egg-laying flocks in Texas and now in Michigan. So far, the number of cases in 2022 and 2023, when the virus was at its peak, were much higher than what we're seeing right now. Also, as the warmer months come around and spring migration of wild flocks decreases, we're likely to see a decrease in these cases and not have it turn out to be a huge outbreak as in past years. Next slide, please. The talk of hogs and pigs lately has been California's Proposition 12, which sets out minimum space requirements for sows. Any pork that is marketed in California must come from compliant sows or must be born of compliant sows. It was passed by voter approval in 2018, but with different court cases and appeals that led to the Supreme Court, it was delayed in implementation. So with the Supreme Court's decision last year in June, the law was allowed to stand and took effect July 1st, 2023, with the first 6 months being a sort of a grace period for producers. As of January 1st, 2024, the full law is in enforcement. If we look at the graph on the right, we can see hog margins have been narrow at the same time that this Proposition 12 has been in place and in working, with frequently negative returns for farrow to finish operations. 14 out of the last 16 months have been negative, with the low of -49 happening in $49 happening back in April of 2023. Currently, that number stands at about -$18. With these low margins, farrowings are decreasing, but pigs per litter is increasing, which is having an offsetting behavior for the reductions in the breeding herd. With that offsetting behavior, pork production is staying high amid these low returns. Now, good news for hog producers is prices have been on an upward trend since the start of the year, catching up to 5-year averages. However, prices are likely to remain volatile throughout the year as producers face high slaughter rates, as well as regulations that are affecting their production practices, such as Prop 12. Proposition 12 is set to add costs to producers in a couple of different ways. Producers that would like to market their pork to California markets have to be compliant, whether or not they are in California. So to do that, they have two options, really. One is to decrease the number of sows they have, and in that way, give each animal the minimum space requirements. The second option is they can expand their facilities to give each, and keep the number of sows the same, to give each animal their minimum space requirements. Either option is going to be very costly for these producers, especially now with high interest rates. Costs will also be felt down the supply chain with trying to keep pigs, compliant pigs and compliant pork separate during the transportation and slaughtering process, as well as labeling all different compliant and non-compliant products. It was believed that the staggered implementation of this law would maybe mitigate some of the effects of the Proposition 12. However, California consumers are already seeing higher prices. One study came out that showed, on average, they're seeing 20% increases in prices for cuts of pork that are covered under the proposition, compared to the rest of the United States that is not seeing those same price increases. Boneless pork loins are having the greatest increase in price at 41%. Pork consumption in California is also decreasing. Its market share of national pork consumption has gone down from 10% to 8%. With this, producers are also worried that there might be other states that are going to enact similar laws that will affect production practices. Next slide, please. To finish things off, I'd like to talk about producer sentiment. And this graph shows producer sentiment and corn prices and gives kind of an idea of what's going on with both. So the blue lines here measure producer sentiment. It's the Purdue Ag Barometer, which is an index of producer sentiment used to measure the general health of the ag economy. The black line shows corn prices. From March 2023 to March 2024, producer sentiment has declined by 5%. Corn prices in that same time frame are down 35%. Soybeans are down 20%, and wheat is down 24%. So with the high decline of these prices of crops, with the relative stability of producer sentiment, that tells me that there's a couple of risk management techniques that producers have in place to kind of mitigate some of this price risk. Crop insurance is not expected to be much of a payment this year, as with those low reference prices or projected prices, like I mentioned earlier. But producers could be hedging in markets or could be relying on high liquidity levels from past years. USDA's farm balance sheet shows strong liquidity levels going into 2024. In the past couple of years, farmers have had high yields as well as high cash prices. Working capital and current assets have also been high, and while those are expected to decline in 2024, it's likely that producers feel a bit of a cushion from those past couple of years, which is keeping their optimism high. With that, I will take any questions. I'd be happy to take any questions before turning things over to Brianna.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. Does the board have any questions of Rebecca on the material presented? Mr. Hall?
I don't, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Smith?
Rebecca, Proposition 12 is a huge concern of livestock producers, and we hear a lot about pork, but it also affects poultry, layers, and it isn't just California. It's my understanding Massachusetts and Maine are considering similar measures, but how to segregate that supply chain in addition to added costs to the producer is a huge concern, and now it's been taken up in the Farm Bill. I know Secretary Vilsack has definitely been definite of the opinion that this is not a good thing for food security for our country. What do you think the odds are the Farm Bill addresses this?
Thank you for that question. I think it really gets at the heart of what producers are worrying about with Prop 12, as well as, our congressmen and people in the USDA. I don't know specifics of where it's likely to show up. I think there's a good chance that we'll see at least something introduced to kind of try and prevent more laws like this from being in place, or at least limit their spread of how maybe strict they are with other producers and production practices. You mentioned that this law also affects, veal producers as well as poultry producers. And I think a lot of the focus is on pork right now because the market has demanded that poultry producers go cage free or free range. And that has started years ago before Prop 12. So a lot of producers were already kind of going that direction. Same thing with pork, just not at the same magnitude. So I think with the concentration of hog producers in the Midwest and Iowa and Minnesota, there might not be enough interest outside of those areas to get something passed through the Farm Bill, but I definitely think that we will see some discussion of it, as well as maybe some other states that put protections into place for their own producers.
Okay, good discussion of that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. I will now turn it over to Brianna.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, Chairman Logan, Board Member Hall, and Board Member Smith. My name is Brianna Tomlinson out of the Denver Field Office. In my part of today's presentation, I will provide an update on the financial condition and performance of the Farm Credit System as of December 31st, 2023. Overall, the system reported solid financial results for the year. System loan growth slowed somewhat compared to previous years. However, net income and capital were up, and the system's loan portfolio continued to perform well with credit risk remaining low. Next slide, please. This first slide focuses on system growth. Overall, the system continued to grow at a fairly moderate pace in 2023, but below the strong growth rates that we've seen and that the system has experienced over the last several years. At December 31st, system assets totaled just under $508 billion, up 6.5%. for the year compared to 9.4% from 2022. System loans totaled $398 billion, up 6.7% for the year. The chart to the left shows both the yearly percentage growth in the loan portfolio as well as the volume gains over the last 10 years. As you can see, the loan growth in 2023 was down compared to previous years, but it continued to be moderately strong. And as has been the trend over the last few years, most of the growth has happened in the second half of the year. The chart to the right illustrates system loan growth in the major loan categories over the past 3 years. Collectively, these loan categories represent almost 95% of the system's portfolio. You'll see on the chart that growth in both real estate, mortgages, and agribusiness lending decreased over the past year. Factors which likely impacted loan demand include the increase in interest rates and declining profit margins in a number of agricultural sectors, but especially the cash grain sector. Growth was strong in production and intermediate lending, and that is mainly due to higher seasonal utilization of operating lines, which can be partially attributed to elevated input prices and other inflationary pressures. The other area that you will see on the graph where there was tremendous loan growth was the rural infrastructure sector, particularly in the power segment, which was up 23% in 2023. Also, but on a smaller scale, the water and wastewater management segment was up 54% for the year, and that was mainly due to rural utility projects. And although not shown on the slide in front of you, the chart, agricultural export financing was down 16%, or almost $1.7 billion, and that was primarily due to lower export volume. And next slide, please. This slide focuses on system loan quality, and overall the system's portfolio continued to perform well in 2023. As of December 31st, non-performing assets totaled $1.8 billion, which was down slightly from which was up slightly from $1.76 billion at year-end 2022. Non-accruals, which account for the largest component of non-performing assets, which you can see in the light blue on the bar graph, increased almost 27% to $1.6 billion compared to $1.3 billion in 2022. The increase in non-accruals was primarily related to credit quality deterioration in impacting just a limited number of borrowers and primarily the tree fruits, hogs, and biofuel sectors, and were mainly real estate mortgage and production and intermediate loans. Despite the increase in non-accruals, as the line on the left indicates, non-performing assets continue to be very low at 0.45% of gross loans and other property owned. The chart on the right focuses on loans classified less than acceptable, which is another indication of loan stress. As you'll see from the yellow on the chart, the percentage of less than acceptable loans was up for each category from 2022. More importantly, though, the overall level continues to be very low, with less than acceptable loans equaling just 4.1% of the total portfolio. Next slide, please. This chart provides a snapshot of the major commodity concentrations within the system's loan portfolio. Overall, you can see based on the pie chart that the system's portfolio is well diversified across a broad range of agricultural sectors. As of year-end 2023, the system's largest commodity concentrations continue to be in cash grains at over 14%, rural infrastructure at just under 14%, and food products at just over 9%. The table on the right indicates the portfolio segments with the strongest loan growth, which were rural infrastructure, food products, and forestry. I would like to note that although the combined portfolio for this system is well diversified, loan portfolios at our individual institutions will vary considerably and be less diversified than the overall total system portfolio. Next slide, please. This slide indicates portfolio volume by state. The Farm Credit System makes credit available in all 50 states and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. The map on the slide shows states which hold at least 1% of system loan volume. As the map illustrates, the system loan volume is geographically dispersed, and the 5 states that hold the highest percentage of system volume are California, Texas, Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota. And collectively, these states account for over 33% of the total portfolio. Next slide, please. Next, we'll go over earnings. The system reported continued earnings growth in 2023. As the chart on the left indicates, the system's combined net income totaled $7.4 billion in 2023, up 2.4% or $177 million from 2022. Provisions for credit losses, which is the red line at the bottom of the chart on the left, totaled $614 million, which was up from $40 million from the prior year. And factors contributing to this increase in the provisions of credit losses included higher specific reserves on individual credits, as well as macroeconomic forecasts for impacting modeled credit losses. The chart on the right highlights the year-over-year changes in key components of net income. Much of the increase in net income, as you can see, was net interest income, and to a lesser extent, higher non-interest income. Higher interest and non-interest income was partially offset, as you can see by the red, by provisions for loan losses and non-interest expenses. The $891 million increase in net interest income, as you can see on the chart on the right, was mainly due to the positive impact of continued loan growth on average earning assets, which increased by $30 billion in 2023. On the rate side, although net interest spread decreased by 23 basis points to 1.93% in 2023, net interest margin increased 4 basis points to 2.43%, which is also accounted for part of the increase in net interest income. Next slide, please. Next, we'll talk about capital and liquidity. Throughout 2023, the system continued to maintain strong capital and liquidity levels. As of year-end, system capital totaled just over $73 billion, and that was up $4.7 billion, or 6.9% year over year. The system's capital to assets ratio was 14.4% at year-end, which was unchanged from a year prior. As noted on the slide, regulatory capital levels at all system banks continue to be fundamentally sound. Days of available liquidity for the 4 funding banks ranged from 161 to 219 days, which was well above the 90-day regulatory minimum. Accumulated other comprehensive loss also declined in 2023 from $4.5 billion to $4.5 billion, compared with $5.5 billion at year-end 2022. And finally, the system continued to have considerable risk-bearing capacity, as total capital and the allowance for credit losses equaled 19% of system loans outstanding as of year-end. Next slide, please. This chart provides a snapshot of the combined FERS ratings for all Farm Credit System banks and associations. Overall, composite FERS ratings improved slightly and continue to reflect the system's strong financial condition. Collectively, over 96% of banks and associations have a composite rating of 1 or 2. There were 2 institutions that had a composite rating of 3 or lower, and that was 1 fewer than a year ago. In total, less than 1% of the system assets are held by institutions rated 3 or lower. Next slide, please. Looking forward, we anticipate a more challenging operating environment for both borrowers and system institutions. As Rebecca touched on, overall farm sector profitability is projected to be down again in 2024, with net cash farm income forecasted at just under $122 billion, which is down from a record of $202 billion from 2022. Declining commodity prices have resulted in narrowing margins for a number of agricultural sectors, especially cash grains, which we spoke about. Cash grains is also the system's largest commodity segment. We've already seen increased stress in certain industries, including tree nuts, poultry, dairy, and swine. And producers are also facing higher non-feed input costs, including interest expense and labor costs. The net result is increased pressure on profitability, diminished liquidity, and a greater reliance on operating lines, as we discussed earlier. Lower margins and higher interest rates could also have significant implications on farmland values. A couple other concerns that we're keeping an eye on are weather events, which are always a risk for agriculture. And although the drought concerns have subsided somewhat, as Rebecca talked about, forecasts for initial forecasts point to a very active hurricane season. We're also closely monitoring avian influenza cases and its impact on the egg and poultry segment, as well as its effect and impact on dairy cattle. Continued war in Ukraine and other global tensions are also expected to result in more volatility in input prices and inputs and commodity prices. This more challenging environment is likely to begin to be reflected in system credit quality. Fortunately, system borrowers and institutions have good to strong liquidity and financial positions, which puts them in a good place and provides a degree of risk-bearing capacity to withstand the volatility. And that concludes my part of today's presentation. Chairman Logan, Board Member Smith, and Board Member Hall, Rebecca and I thank you for your time and attention today. I'd be happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you very much. Does the board have any questions of Brianna on the material presented? Mr. Hall.
I have questions, but appreciate today's presentation, but want to say how much I appreciated the briefing we had yesterday, able to go in a little bit deeper into some of these topics, especially system capital. So very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Smith.
Yeah, my question would be on capital. If we can go back to slide 7, please. Can we go back to slide 7? Maybe not. There we go. Thank you. I'd like maybe a little more commentary. Back in 2017 through 2019, we peaked out with capital. The capital asset ratio in that 16.7, 16.8, 16.9% range, and that was following several years of income compression, some serious threats to profitability, just some real stagnant years in farm income. Looking ahead to 2023 now, it seems like we're looking at an era that we're about to enter another era of maybe some profitability compression, particularly in the cash grain sector, but a lot of other sectors. Interest rates are double, and yet we're at fairly low capital to asset ratio right now, and have been now for 2 years in a declining trend. Is that a concern of OE that you're watching closely, Brianna?
Thank you for that comment and question, Board Member Smith. Yes, it is an area that OE is looking at and is concerned about. I believe our chief examiner just issued a memorandum yesterday about long-term financial stewardship. And that is something that we will be looking at institutions, across the system over the next couple of years. It's part of our national oversight plan.
Okay, very good. Good timely message there. Thank you.
I don't have any questions. So if there are no further questions by the board, I thank the staff for their presentation.
Thank you.
Please turn to the adjournment tab. If there's no further business to bring before the board, I will entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we adjourn the meeting.
Second the motion.
The motion has been made and seconded. Is there any further discussion on the matter? Hearing none, the secretary will record the vote on the motion.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Hall?
Aye.
Chairman Logan?
Aye. The motion carries. The meeting is adjourned.